Hello, welcome back to Transfer News Live. I'm Statman Dave, and this is the Scout Report, the number one place for analysis on the biggest transfers in European football. Today, we're focusing on Eddie Howe's Newcastle United. The Magpies took a step further last season, qualifying for the Champions League again, but also winning their first trophy in 70 years, beating Liverpool at Wembley 2-1 in the Carabao Cup Final. So Eddie Howe needs some reinforcements to allow him to compete on two fronts once again, the Champions League and the Premier League. Get into the comments below, which players do you think Eddie Howe should sign this summer? Of course, if you're new around here, make sure to hit that subscribe button. But anyway, let's get this party started. Eddie Howe's favourite setup as Newcastle manager has been a 4-3-3, allowing them to press high up the pitch and force their opponents into mistakes. This has allowed Newcastle to do very well against the top sides, but also batter the teams lower down the league. Of course, we've seen some other approaches, a 4-2-3-1, pairing the likes of Callum Wilson with Alexander Isak in arguably a front two, but also at the back end of the season, we saw Eddie Howe experiment with a back three. Basically moving Newcastle to a 3-4-3. I think the great result they got against Chelsea in the Premier League. That's allowed them to play players deeper to add extra attacking elements. I think Jacob Murphy as a right wing back, overlapping the right winger to provide extra threat in the final third. But in terms of setups, that's been his main setups as Newcastle. But for today's video, we're going to use the 4-3-3, Eddie Howe's favoured setup, as our model for discussion. So let's start in goal. Newcastle United have got two pretty good goalkeepers in Nick Pope and Martin Dubravka. I don't think right this summer is the time to reinvest. James Trafford has been heavily linked. I think he's a very good goalkeeper. But for right now, I think Newcastle need to spend their money elsewhere, strengthening their team through the pitch. Of course, for this season, Nick Pope will be the number one once again. 8th in the Premier League for post-shot expected goals and 7th for save percentage. But I think the most important thing about Nick Pope is not only his ability to claim crosses, more importantly is to sweep up behind the defensive line. Given that Newcastle's shape is super aggressive and they play a high line quite a lot of the time to kind of press their opponents and congest the centre of the pitch, allowing them to counter-attack in a really good way, Nick Pope has to be a goalkeeper that's capable coming off his line and sweeping up the play, and he does that very well. And this has allowed Newcastle to be very good when winning the ball back. In fact, since the start of last season, Newcastle scored more goals from high turnovers than any other Premier League side, and that is testament to having a goalkeeper that can sweep and be super aggressive off the ball. So that's the keepers done. I don't think Newcastle should really spend in that zone. Let's move into the defence. I think this is an area where Newcastle should make a signing. So first and foremost, starting at right back, Tino Livramento is going to start in that position. I was really impressed with Livramento's growth this season. Power, speed and intensity. His pressing was very good from either fullback position. But the interesting side, he actually played left back when Lewis Hall got injured since around March time, and Newcastle won more points than any other Premier League side in that period. So Livramento could do a job on the left flank. I do like Lewis Hall as well. I think when he comes back, it'll be fantastic for Newcastle. He provides that duality of being able to play either inverted or providing that overlap depending on whether the winger stays wide or cuts inside. Lewis Hall is destined to be a star in the Premier League. In terms of the two centre-backs for Newcastle, Fabian Schär and Sven Botman are probably the first choice guys. Sven Botman has had a pretty mixed career so far at Newcastle, a lot of injuries, especially the knees. But when he plays, he is absolutely superb in possession, allowing Newcastle to build out from the back and fire balls into midfield to allow them to get into the final third. But the concerns have been the injuries. He missed around 60 games since joining Newcastle. With Fabian Schär and, of course, the great Dan Burn being over the age of 33 years old, it could definitely be a time for Newcastle to recruit in that area. Of course, Dan Burn could be used in the left fullback position as well, but I do like Lewis Hall's development, especially, in possession of the football. He's a player that's really grown in the last season, got more assists from fullback than any other fullback under the age of 23 in the Premier League. Driving wide, carrying inside, providing that threat. But I do think it's an area of their defence that does need strengthening this summer. They need to bring in at least one young lad to add a bit of depth. In terms of players that I would have highly recommended for Newcastle, Christian Mascara would have been great, a player that wins the ball back superbly well, is physical, is probably perfect for the Premier League, but of course he looks set to be joining Arsenal. Another one that would have been good, Diomande from Sporting Club de Portugal. But another player looks set, destined to the Premier League with Crystal Palace. Fantastic football out of the back. I'd still say for Newcastle, if they could get him, they should definitely put a bid in. So if those two players are already moving to the Premier League, another one that I'd love to see in England would be Scalvini from Atalanta. He's a player that would add a lot to Newcastle's build-up play, capable of playing in back threes or back fours. But what's super impressive about Scalvini is if Newcastle, for example, do switch to a back three system, let's say Sven Botman comes into the middle, Burn on the left-hand side of the defence, the wing-backs playing a little higher, the centre-mid's a little bit deeper. Scalvini is very good at getting forward. When you look at his statistics for Atalanta in the last full season he played, of course last season he was injured quite a bit, which we'll talk about in a second, but was very good, not only carrying the ball out, but also when he'd release the pass into midfield or into the winger, he would join the attack. He's arguably one of the players that could be perfect as a kind of wide centre-back. That's a player that can either attack on the inside or alternatively overlap the wide player and get into the final third. Think Sheffield United under Chris Wilder. Scalvini has that quality, and we look at his goal-creating actions and his assist numbers per 90 in his last full season in Serie A. There were some very, very good numbers. So at the start, Scalvini could come in and maybe play in a back three when Newcastle are playing that system and shape. And then long term, of course, if Sven Botman can keep himself fit, we'll partner him in a back four. But let's throw back our defensive midfielder in, because that's kind of 4-3-3 shape we're talking about right now. In terms of price tags for Scalvini, it would be around 50 million euros. With the injuries over the past season and a half, Newcastle potentially could get that down. But what they're going to get is one of the best young defenders on the planet. A ball-playing centre-back who's got real quality in the final third. But let's move into midfield. This is an area of the pitch where Newcastle really excel. Their three-man midfield, I would say, is the best in the league off the ball. We're talking Tonali at defensive midfield, we're talking Joe Linton, and of course Bruno Guimaraes in that area. In terms of that setup, what I like about what we previously saw before Tonali's ban was actually Guimaraes playing more as the DM, the guy that's getting on the ball and making things happen. In terms of his role from this area, you could argue he's a bit of a roaming playmaker. A player that will get on the ball in all areas, will carry forward, but very much will always be on the move looking to get possession. I actually prefer Bruno Guimaraes as an 8. And if we look at his statistics in that position, we see a better player. A player that can score goals, that can get assists, that can operate in the final third. In terms of his passing quality, he ranks 3rd in Europe's top 5 leagues for goal-creating actions following live passes, showing his impact higher up the pitch on the ball. And I think he's only going to get better in that position. With Tonali screening, of course Joe Linton playing box-to-box, who's still an absolute menace for opposition managers to deal with, Newcastle's midfield three will continue to be a massive handful for Premier League midfields. And I think Newcastle are pretty well set for the future. Obviously Lewis Miley showed real class when he's played. I think he's got big potential. Quite like how Eddie Howe hasn't overused him at his raw age of 17 years old. I think he has got massive potential to be a real good midfielder for Newcastle in the league. Also, Joe Willock is going to be there. And Newcastle may need to buy another 6 if Sean Longstaff leaves the club. That's probably the only position I think they need to strengthen in the midfield area. I think they're sorted in the 8 area, but the 6th position, maybe get one more. Alternatively, someone like Scalvini could play that position. We've seen managers over the years, kind of mess around with their midfields. And one of the tactical things that we might see in the coming years is actually more players playing as halfbacks. That's a player that starts as a number 6, but drops in between their defenders, splits them, pushes the fullbacks forward, and creates arguably a back three structure, allowing Newcastle to have possession a bit deeper with Scalvini in this centre position, spreading the passes and getting Newcastle into the attacking third. But again, let's move back to the 4-3-3 because that's what we're kind of focusing on right now. So again, Newcastle's midfield three that will be so dominant once again. Joe Linton, Bruno Guimaraes and Sandro Tonali sitting at the base of midfield. So moving into the attack, we're going to start with a centre forward. Of course, that is going to be Alexander Isak, the most complete centre forward in the Premier League. Quality at dropping off the line and receiving into feet. Quality at spinning into the channels and getting on the ball. Quality at drifting wide and receiving switches of play. Is there anything Isak can't do? He can score tap-ins, he can score bangers, he can set up teammates, he can create chances. When you look at his statistics in the Premier League, sensational for a number 9. Directly involved in the most goals, created the most chances, completed the most dribbles, basically did everything you want from a modern day number 9. But for Newcastle United, keeping Alexander Isak at the football club is an absolute must. Similar to Bruno Guimaraes, these are the two stars of Newcastle right now. Two players that arguably should be indispensable for the football club. Players that don't have a price tag. Players that need to stay if Newcastle want to hit the heights that their owners really look for. I think one of the big things with that, keeping Isak this summer is going to be massive to see where Newcastle go next. In terms of Alexander Isak, only 4 players in Europe's top 5 leagues were directly involved in more goals than the Swedish number 14. Newcastle need to build from Isak and sign more players to get the best out of the Swede. So now let's move to the wide area, starting on the left wing. Anthony Gordon had a bit of a disappointing 24-25 season. He kept his excellent defensive work rate, but his goals plus assists halved based on the last season. Of course, that meant the door was open for Harvey Barnes, who had a really good end to the year. Since the start of March, only 5 players in the Premier League were directly involved in more goals than Harvey Barnes. And I actually like Harvey Barnes also, maybe as a striker with Alexander Isak, potentially switching Newcastle to a kind of 3 at the back structure with wing backs in these areas. Of course, Newcastle defend quite asymmetrical. We saw against Chelsea, they basically played a 4-man midfield of kind of Barnes, Guimaraes, and Isak up top. But as soon as Newcastle won the ball, they switched it with Barnes playing a little bit more narrow and Guimaraes joining the central midfield area, looking a little bit like a 3-4-3 in possession, something they could do again with this season. Barnes being very much a goal scorer inside forward in the final third. But let's get back to the 4-3-3. Of course, dropping Lewis Hall, pushing Harvey Barnes wide, and maintaining our 3-man midfield. So on the right wing is an interesting one for Newcastle. Signing of Anthony Elanga means there's going to be big competition for that position. But we can't ignore how good Jacob Murphy was last season. Only Lamine Yamal, Michael Olise, and Mohamed Salah got more assists in Europe's top 5 leagues. He played some of the best football of his career. I loved how direct he was in the final third. Either, taking his man on and directly getting a kind of a cross into the box, or alternatively, hitting early shots. I think that goal he scored in the penalty area from a really wide area that fired into the roof of the net, really good goal. But I do think with Murphy, I think there's a way they can get into this team at wing-back or even at full-back. Anthony Elanga's been signed from Nottingham Forest and will provide a lot of threat. The big thing with Anthony Elanga is his speed is ridiculous. We saw that for Nottingham Forest last season. And I think when you look at his numbers, he only had 1 fewer assist than Jacob Murphy with 11 in the Premier League. But I do think you could potentially play both Murphy and, of course, Anthony Elanga, with Elanga moving to the left wing if Harvey Barnes and Anthony Gordon are a little bit out of form, with Murphy playing on the right. That would maintain the link between Isak and Murphy. They combined for 7 goals last season in the Premier League, with Murphy assisting Isak. But I also think when we look at this long term and how this shape can be, it could be quite interesting to see those 2 guys on the flanks. They both work exceedingly hard, which could get another player into the starting 11. And that, of course, is Hugo Ekitike. The Eintracht Frankfurt number 9 is a hot prospect in European football. In terms of his goals, he scored 15 in the Bundesliga, but slightly underperformed as expected goals. Something he needs to work on is his finishing. But he's a player that creates shots out of nothing, with dribbles, with flicks, with tricks, or just simply feinting his opponent getting shots away. I like him as a footballer, and I think Newcastle is the perfect place. I see a lot of Alexander Isak in Hugo Ekitike's game, while Alexander Isak was at Real Sociedad. That ability to drop off the line, receive into feet, quickly flick the ball to his teammates and get himself into the penalty area. He very much is a flary player in the final third, but someone that could form a very devastating partnership with Alexander Isak. So in terms of the setup, that could go a number of ways. Number 1, potentially Jacob Murphy could be dropped to a fullback position, or alternatively we could see a bit of a 4-4-2 structure with Guimaraes operating in a right wing defensive position. Of course, if Newcastle win the ball, he can move inside and basically create this kind of narrow 3-man midfield. But in terms of the partnership, I think Ekitike is better suited on the left than the right. But in terms of setup and structure, in this 4-4-2, Newcastle could be devastating on the counter. And that's something we saw with Frankfurt when Omar Mamouche paired with Ekitike in the Bundesliga. They were so quick at being direct. And of course, a 4-4-2, yes, Newcastle lose a man in midfield. But arguably how we've got it set up here, with, of course, Joe Linton, Tonali and Guimaraes a little bit to the right-hand side, it could allow Newcastle to be that team that can play super direct into a number 9, little flick, little 1-2, and then you're in behind the defence. That's exactly how I would play right now. Alternatively, if, for example, Newcastle wanted to continue with that three-man midfield, Ekitike very much could be pushed to the left-hand side. It's an area that he's played before and an area that he excels. But in terms of Ekitike, where you'd want him is in this inside left position if he's operating wide. This would mean he'd have to move into a central area, and Lewis Hall could provide the width in the final third. This creates a system where Elanga holds the width on the right wing, Bruno Guimaraes operates as a kind of inside position on the right, Tonali and Joe Linton provide a double pivot, and Livramento sits a little bit deeper, creating a back three structure. This very much would work. And again, you'd see the likes of Hugo Ekitike and Isak thrive. They've both got that like nice ability, receiving to feet, quick little pops of passes, moving the ball between them, little dribbles, combination play and goals. I think it'll add a lot to Newcastle's attack. And talking about combination play, Ekitike last season was creative. He got 8 assists in the Bundesliga. When we look at strikers in Europe's top 5 leagues, that is second. So having the ability to get on the ball is only going to make Isak score more goals. I don't think it's about replacing Isak with Ekitike. I think it's about keeping Isak and buying Ekitike. That's the best way that Newcastle can compete on multiple fronts. Alternatively, if you wanted to move to maybe the back three structure, let's say if Joel Linton or Guimaraes has picked up an injury, that's definitely an area where you could see Ekitike, Anthony Elanga dropping a little bit more narrow, and of course maybe a Kieran Trippier. We saw that last season, moving into the back three. We haven't really mentioned Kieran Trippier, but of course still provides great value from set pieces, still good from open play, and I think this outside centre-back role in this shape and system could really work for Trippier. That would allow Newcastle to play very much a narrow front three. The wing-backs provide the width in the final third, allowing them to build out through the back through Scalvini. We've looked at 3 players today that would be Newcastle's dream signings. Hugo Ekitike, Anthony Elanga's already been signed. Of course, Scalvini as the centre-back. Of course, get into the comments below. Who would you buy for Newcastle and how would you allow them to compete on multiple fronts this season? I've, of course, been Statman Dave on Transfer News Live. If you're new around here, make sure to hit that subscribe button, like the video. But anyway, I'll see you next time.